Must be warm outside, huh?
It is, yeah.
Wow.
Did you overnight more photos?
I don't think so, really.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Do you have finals, Ezra?
Oh my goodness, do I ever?
And papers, right?
Yeah, lots of papers, 2 finals, working on all of it now.
Wow. And when did you get out?
I'm done on my last final is I believe the 10th or 11th, and then I'm leaving for my summer job on the 15th.
What are you going to be doing?
I'm working at a theater in Utah this summer.
Wow. Sounds cool.
I'm looking forward to it.
Wow. How are you getting out there?
Flying, catching a 6 a.m. flight out of the Cleveland Hopkins Airport.
Do you have somebody who's going to take you there?
Yeah, my
Okay.
roommate's father is going to drive me to the airport, so luckily I've got that figured out.
That sounds great. And then what do you do with your stuff for the summer?
That's a great question. I have figured that one out. I've got my checked bag and my carry-on coming with me, and then the rest of my stuff I'm going to be storing at my roommate next year. I'm just storing it at her house for the summer. So.
Oh, good. Oh, you get it all organized. Wow. All right, you're resourceful.
Figuring it out.
And then do you have a Jewish community out there that you'll...
No, I'm small town Utah, so I think the Jews are few and far between. We'll see how it goes.
There you go.
It's hard.
Cheryl, my son is visiting from Buffalo. He loves it there.
I miss Buffalo very much. So.
Do you? Did you ever go to a pastry shop called Butter Block?
No.
It's at Five Corners. Oh my God, really good croissant.
5 Points Bakery. That's at 5 Corners.
That's there too. That's across the street, more or less. Yeah.
Yeah, 5
And then there's another cafe kind of thing too.
Yeah.
Right there. I forget the name of it.
Yeah, 5 Points was one of my favorite places. I'm a breadaholic, so that was perfect.
Wow, nice.
Well,
I like it. It's really fun going up.
Yes.
They're moving to the top of a big old house, and it'll be like a block from there, so a block north.
Oh, it's such a great neighborhood, the west side of Buffalo. It's really wonderful. That's great. And this is a nice time of year there.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good to see you all. We're going to get started with a song from Israel because this Thursday is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day. We've got a couple announcements locally about special events that folks can attend for Yom HaAtzmaut. So Ezra, if you could share Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, it's an Israeli song for peace by a rock band called Sheva.
All right, is this visible for everyone? I think we're good to go. The tune I know for Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, with a lot of the Israeli songs, there's always a chance there's 12 different competing tunes out there, so I tend to go with the one I know best. The tune I know for this is Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu, Od Yavo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam Aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam, salam, salam. Aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam, salam. One more time through. Ojavo shalom aleinu. Ojavo shalom aleinu. Ojavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam. Aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam, salam.
Okay, so this is a prayer for peace, and obviously an Israeli rock band praying for peace in the last 20 years is dealing directly with the issues of peace with the Palestinians and that endless hope that somehow we will get there. It's not easy. Ezra's going to put a couple links in the chat about a couple programs this Thursday. This is a couple back-to-back days of celebration. Tuesday night, Wednesday is Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day. Wednesday night, Thursday is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day. And it's a fascinating dynamic to go from the tears of Memorial Day smack into the joy of Independence Day. Because here in this country, we spend 6 weeks separating those. And so because of the ongoing wars and the ongoing violence, it's been very poignant and almost dramatic to go from the transition from the pain of losing so many soldiers to the joy. And Israel is such a small country, it's about the size of New Jersey. So every family has lost someone. And all of a sudden you think about, well, here Memorial Day, like people might have lost folks back in World War II, but primarily since World War II, we haven't had tremendous loss like that. So Israel's still reverberating very, very powerfully with its loss and its inability to have a peace plan. Yitzhak Rabin, I was telling my students this morning, you know, his assassination in, oh my gosh, it was almost 30 years ago now, that killed the peace plan for all intents and purposes. We were this close. And now we're miles apart, right? To think about how close we were the day before he died to how close we were now. And it's like we're living in two different planes of existence. The distance we are from that dream that was right around the corner the day he died. On Thursday late afternoon, there's two very special programs. In Beechwood at the Maltz Museum, in their parking lot, they're going to have a huge Israel festival. There's going to be food and music and games and lots of great stuff. There's going to be a lot of folks. It's going to be all outdoors. It's all free. That's going to start at 6 p.m. Thursday evening, probably go till about 8. And then if you are in Summit County and you want something a little bit closer at the Akron JCC, there's going to be dinner and a concert. Now, I did know when I went to that link, they do want RSVPs in advance if you're going to go to the concert or to reserve some food. But if you're planning to go to either place, they're both, the music at Akron is free. I'm sure the food will be for whatever the cost of the food is. But really nice programs to connect with Israel's 74th Independence Day. Very fun to be out there with all the other folks who want to celebrate. And the other nice thing about, at least in Beechwood, there's a lot of Israelis in this community. A number of Israelis have moved to this community over the years. And so to celebrate with them is kind of like this special treat. We get to kind of be part of their independence moment and independence experience. And so it's a meaningful thing to support that group right now. Okay. Today we're going to talk about denominations. Next week we're going to talk about the fall holidays. We'll talk about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then the final week on May 15th we'll wrap it up. I know some of you might have Mother's Day plans, and you're excused if you need to miss stuff. But hopefully we can squeeze it in next week. What I want to do around the denomination stuff is, first I want to check in with each of you with a specific question in mind today, not just the, the new and good stuff. I have a specific point. I want to know from you, what questions do you have about the Jewish denominations in this country? Let me just run through them. So there's the liberal reform, there is the liberal reconstructionist group, which I am ordained from. TBS is a Reformed synagogue. Conservative sits in that middle ground. Orthodox is in the traditional right. And ultra-Orthodox or Chabad is kind of on that far right extreme. And then just being in that left to right, there's a couple other tiny groups. There are secular humanists. Cleveland has a secular humanist group that's kind of on that fringe left. And also there's Jewish Renewal, which is kind of Rev. Zalman Schachter Shalomi's group, a tiny group here in this area, but also kind of on that left extreme marginal place of progressive Judaism. So the request out to each of you is, what questions do you have just in general about Jewish denominations as we dive into the topic? So I'm gonna take the questions in-house first, and then I'll turn to our Zoomers. So Zoomers, store up your questions. You don't have to put these in the chat. I'll swing around and kind of call you out one by one. But we'll start here. So do you need to pass? You can think from there.
No, I've been thinking, so I'm okay. So, all right, they seem very different, right?
What?
All the different
Very different.
denominations.
They're very different.
I don't, to be honest, I don't really know all the differences. But like, let's say for me, could I just like, can you just hop? Like, I don't have to, I just go one day and be like,
So
okay, I'm here
that's
now.
an amazing question. So anybody who wants to go to a Shabbat service, a Friday night or Saturday morning service at a Reform, Reconstructionist, or Conservative synagogue can just go. They could just show up and welcome, thank you, come on, have a good time. And you should feel welcome. You should feel like you have a free ticket to do that. So point one is yes. Orthodox, still pretty much yes. And I would say you just need to be a very, very welcoming space, because Orthodox boundaries are different than liberal Jewish boundaries. And as long as you know what those boundaries are, you're going to be fine. But yes, the same applies for Orthodox Jewish communities.
Okay.
Great question. Okay. Julie.
Well, that's one of the things I like about this, is that there is so many, and they seem to all get along,
Sort of.
more or less,
Sort of.
kind of.
Sort of. We'll give that, we'll kind of delineate those boundaries by the end of the class. You'll see where there's actually some strong, we don't do that stuff that way. And you'll kind of see that.
So my question was kind of going into hers. So if I was to go to a temple in the one in Beechwood, would I be able to go in at this point? Would I have to wait?
No, conversion candidates are welcome, as well as born Jewish folks. They can always, what I call shul hop. They can hop from shul to shul, and they can figure out which cup of tea they like. Do you like green tea, black tea, herbal tea? You can kind of taste those. What you should know is that the more liberal groups have a lot more English, the more traditional groups have a lot more Hebrew, and the more traditional you go, the less English you're going to get. So that's just like a fair warning that they're all musically beautiful, but the Hebrew quotient changes as you get in a more traditional setting.
And how did this happen? I can't think of any other religion or philosophy where you have this great of a.
Yeah, we'll do a little historical walkthrough.
Okay.
You can table the question if you want.
How did the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, how did they settle on the clothes that they wear? It's not I know it's very Eastern European, but it's not like traditionally
No,
Jewish.
it's a brand new
and it's-
thing. Yeah, this clothes thing is a rather new phenomenon, probably in the last 75 to 100 years, maybe 125 years. When they came here, they realized that they didn't want to assimilate too much. And so part of this boundary around avoiding complete assimilation into the American melting pot was to maintain some kind of clothing standard from when their grandparents moved here 100 years ago. So they're dressed as if they are in Poland or Russia in 1900 instead of year 21, 2020. So part of this is a retrogression as far as a clothing style or fashion sense. I'm simplifying it by a lot, but what they're reclaiming is these Jewish fashion ideas that might have been popular in Warsaw or Moscow or parts of Eastern Germany in the early 1800s for hats and other things like that. So it's almost like Russian royalty from 1800, like the elites in Russia 200 years ago might have had these kinds of clothing styles, and they're kind of locked into that time period. That's to kind of simplify it, but that's a lot of what were the black suits and the white shirts, the side curls, the long beard, a lot of that comes from. Gonna just pop into the Zoom room and get some of your questions about Jewish denominations. And I'm going to start with some of the born Jews first. So Wendy Hess, do you have any questions about Jewish denominational stuff?
Not really. I was just surprised to learn that, the bat mitzvah came out of Reconstructionism.
Yeah.
And I have been to Reconstructionist services, and they're a whole lot longer than Reformed ones.
Oh.
And I assume that's very deliberate.
Yeah, they kind of sit in that weird middle ground between Reform and conservative, and what they want to try and do is preserve some of the traditional parts of the service that seem to get skipped over or edited out by Reform services. Reform services tend to be short, to the point.
Yep.
Friday nights are about an hour, you go home. Saturday mornings are about an hour and a half, you go home. And so conservative services are, on Saturday morning, they're 3 hours, 2.5, 3 hours, sometimes longer. So Reconstructionist services tend to be about 2 hours on a Saturday morning. They're a little bit longer, so especially if you go to a bar bat mitzvah, but they're not nearly as long or as duplicative. They don't do any of the repeated information that conservative synagogues do when they add in that additional service at the end on Saturday mornings. It's a good question. Julius, any denominational questions for you?
No, I'm good, but thank you.
Okay. Cheryl, any questions about Jewish denominational stuff that are rattling around for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's entirely denominational, but from my own experience, having come up in a fairly observant traditional way, and then being alienated from Judaism for many years, marrying a non-Jew, and then trying to find my way back. I just experienced the more traditional places as very hostile to intermarriage. And so, since now a large majority of American Jews are intermarried, I'm wondering about the denominations and whether they're really wrestling with how they can be more welcoming, because, I think they're driving people away.
So we'll dive into that distinction in a few minutes when we get to, after the history walk. We'll look at the who's a Jew question, and we'll really dive into that stark divide between Reform and Reconstructionist communities that are pretty welcoming of intermarriage, and conservative and Orthodox, which are not welcoming whatsoever around intermarriage. And like, how did that develop, and where are they? And what we can honestly say, to be brief about it, is the conservative movement is contracting greatly because of it. that this resistance to intermarriage and acceptance of intermarriage is really shrinking the conservative movement pretty quickly. And I would say, in about 20 years, we might not even have a conservative movement, maybe even in 10. Yeah, it's getting dramatic. It used to be in 1950, 1955, it was the largest movement in the country. 34% of American Jews in 1955 were conservative. And even in 2000, it had dropped down to about 25%. Now it's probably close to 15%. It might even be lower than that. It's phenomenal how quickly this has heavily impacted the conservative movement. It's a really great question. Okay, now going to move to other folks. Gene Rhodes, what questions about the movements do you have today?
I can never get my arms around the difference between Orthodox and modern Orthodox.
Okay, great. One of the ways I want to think about this is like on a left to right spectrum. If you think of Reform being on the liberal lefty end and Reconstructionists also being pretty lefty, conservative being mostly central, Orthodox is sort of on that traditional right-wing thing, except when you get to the really tiny group called modern Orthodox. Because once you get to the Orthodox perspective of completely accepting Jewish law as your guiding focus, and that becomes the boundary. Are you going to keep all of the Shabbat commandments? Are you going to keep all of the kosher commandments? If you are, you're in that Orthodox mindset. Then you've got this really new question of, in that continuum of traditional minded Jews who are Shabbat observant, kosher observant, are there more liberal lefty folks and are there more traditional conservative folks? And modern Orthodox tends to be that liberal edge of the Orthodox Jewish community, where they do give women a bit of equality. They do give women some professional roles in the community. They do give women a accountant. There has to be not just 10 men who are making the minyan, the prayer quorum, like there is in an Orthodox setting, but there has to be 10 women as well. So both are, but they can't sit together. So what is interesting at a modern Orthodox synagogue, you'll often find what's called partner minyans, where you'll have a screen down the room and the men are on one side, the women are on the other. But you'll need, in a modern Orthodox minyan, you'll need 10 men and 10 women. In a Chabad minyan or an Orthodox minyan, you only need 10 men. Right, so that's kind of like a tiny, interesting shade of gray on that piece. Okay, Janet, what questions are coming up for you today?
Not so much a question, but what I think that I personally would need is something like a flow chart explaining the major differences between each and how they relate to one another, if indeed they do at all. I need something very simple like that for myself. So no questions yet.
Hopefully we'll present something like a flow chart on Jewish identity at least. And you can at least, if we need to, I can share that chart later on by email. Gordon, what's a question that's cropping up for you?
Okay, so I have two questions. One is, do you see any kind of cultural change from all the intermarriage that's happening mostly in Reform Jews?
Yeah, for sure. For sure, there's a huge cultural shift because, I think the cultural shift that I'm noticing, it's a very interesting question, has to do with Judaism as an ethnicity. My parents, for example, were ethnic Jews. They ate Jewish food. This Jewish food was coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland and from Russia. And they were used to being around their parents who had Russian accents and Polish accents. And so this kind of ethnic Judaism, which I think we have moved away from quite a bit, still has remnants and resonances. And I do think the influx of both interfaith folks as well as Sephardi communities, as well as LGBTQ folks, has really created a reassessment of ethnic Judaism. And so I think one of the great distinctions is people who are culturally Jewish, who, let's say, they do the bagel lox and cream cheese stuff, right? That, and they do the Woody Allen movies or some such, right? That kind of New York Jewish identity, which may have resonated in the 80s or 90s very strongly, seems to be pretty much gone. The generation, right? If that was my parents' generation, the next generation has no real resonance with the food or with the cultural connections. They may eat the foods, but it doesn't bring them that level of cultural fulfillment. And so what I want to say is, alongside, let's say, Italian ethnicity, Irish ethnicity, all of those have grown dramatically weaker, especially through the generations. We can see that that kind of Jewish ethnicity seems to have slipped away. And what seems to replace it in its stead, primarily in the Reform and Reconstructionist world, is this welcoming of non-Jewish partners, this welcoming of women as leaders in our community, not second-class citizens whatsoever, and this welcoming of LGBTQ folks who are dramatically present in our communities. And therefore, you've got a perhaps broader tent, a tent that doesn't just welcome in ethnic Jews from Eastern Europe, but now welcomes in Jews from around the world, and the folks who love them, and the other extended cultural connections. And so the new issue around this also is Jews of color, that in the last 10 years, we're seeing quite a bit of influence, especially among younger folks, of Jews of color. So people my age, the Jews of color is always in a very small group, less than 10%. Gordon, people of your age, of 20 and under, that number is almost double, right? So it's a really interesting generational shift around Jews of color and how they're identifying after that Jewish identity. So great. Now you had said a second question. What was the second question?
Well, my spin-off question for that was, do you think that American Jews are getting further and further away from Israeli Jews? And do you think that there's like more of a cultural void?
I think the cultural void's always been there. I think we're just now more aware of it. But I do think that we are now living in a time where in Israel, they announced this week their census for the world Jewish population of 15 million Jews, with I think 7 million living in Israel, about 7 million living here, and sprinkled in Europe and in other places, the other remainder. And so at the time of the Talmud, at the time of Jesus, when the rabbis were reinventing Judaism on the fly, we had two Jewish population centers. We had the group of folks living in and around Babylonia, think Baghdad, think Iran, and we had the group living in and around Jerusalem and northern Israel. And so we had two Talmuds. We had the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud that both get written over those 200 years of rabbinic Judaism. I think we are living in something similar now. We have two Jewish population centers, one in Jerusalem and thereabouts, and one in New York and thereabouts. And they're very different. And they're very sympathetic to things that they do, and they rely on each other financially and for emotional support, but culturally, very, very different cultural norms. And so therefore, I think it's a really interesting idea that when I want to learn about Jewish wisdom, it's one thing to learn from a New York rabbi or a New York philosopher. It's another thing to sit with an Israeli who's got a very different perspective on life in Israel, secular culture, that intersection between secular and Orthodox, and how it's playing out. So it's a fascinating perspective to kind of suspend my judgment and think about Israeli Jewish identity as very different than my own, and with a lot of different ways for it to be colored and influenced. Yeah. Okay.
And my second question, if you have time.
Quick one, go ahead.
My second question was, what exactly are Messianic Jews? I've heard a few things about them, but I've never quite understood that.
I'm going to table that question for now. We'll get to that in our last session because I kind of put that in the trivia category. We'll get there. And the way I'll talk about Messianic Jews is through legal definitions, both in this country and through the Israeli Supreme Court. They've come up with some legal definitions about Messianic Jews. But we'll kind of hold that off for our final session. But bring that back to me, when we get to that last one. Okay. I want to now do kind of a historical walk through 20th century American Judaism, because when we left off with like the historical walk, we finished off around 1900 with the wave of immigrants coming to this country from Eastern Europe. So just to kind of refresh our memories, the first big wave of immigration to this country comes around 1840 from Germany. And we get, I don't know, about 20,000 Jews from Germany. That group of Jews is middle class, college educated. They are very assimilated into the broader society. And they come to this country well-resourced, and they flourish pretty dramatically. That's Levi Strauss inventing Levi jeans in 1849 for the gold rush. Yeah.
What was their impetus to come here?
A better life. They didn't think that Germany was going to be, let's say, then the place for their flourishing. They thought the United States was going to be a place of wealth. And I think primarily it was an economic decision. That's distinctly different from the Polish Russian Jews who come in the 1880s, 1890s, my great-grandparents, who were fleeing terrible pogroms, horrible anti-Semitism. They were not wealthy, they were poor. They were not college educated. They might know a lot of languages because they were merchants, but they didn't have any college education. And so if the German group in the 1840s is about, I'm going to correct myself. I said 20,000. I think that number is probably a little bit bigger. I think it's about 200,000. The group that comes over from Russia and Poland is 2 million. It's huge. There's a lot of folks coming during that 35-year window between 1889 and 1924, where over 2.2 million Jews are fleeing the terrors of anti-Semitism. And this leads to Theodor Herzl saying we need to have a Zionist dream because the anti-Semitism in Europe is so desperate. Of course, no one listens to him because the Holocaust happens anyway, right? If we were listening to Herzl in 1904, we might have responded very differently in time for the Holocaust, but we waited because we thought he was a little crazy. He might have been like most prophets are a little crazy.
Yeah.
So here in Cleveland, let's play this out in Northeast Ohio. When those German Jews come to Cleveland, they set up the first synagogues here in Cleveland in the 1850s, 1860s. And those are German-speaking synagogues, they're Reformed synagogues, and they're the first synagogues here in this area. When the Eastern European Jews come here in the 1890s, 1900s, they don't want to have anything to do with these German Jews. They could care less about praying in English, they pray in Hebrew. They've always prayed in Hebrew, and Hebrew is how they connect. They're very traditional. And so they set up small synagogues, tiny ones, in kind of like in what are called shtibla, little rooms. And so around 1890, 1900, American Judaism is going through this bifurcation. These waves of immigrants are coming. The folks who've been here have been setting up synagogues. The new folks want something that is different for their needs around tradition. And there's so many traditional Jews coming that group of immigrants even splits among itself. Some of them want traditional Orthodox Judaism the way they grew up. It wasn't even called Orthodox, right? Orthodox is the new term they use to self-identify as a distinction from Reform Judaism. And then there's a second group that says, we like that traditional stuff. We like the Hebrew prayers, but we also want to do science. We also want to do modern life. We also want to engage with American life and American culture. This group that wants science and tradition is conservative Judaism. And so they're both birthing at about the same time, right around 1900. The Jewish Theological Seminary in New York becomes the home for the conservative movement. The Orthodox have their own seminary not too far away. And so by 1900, we then have three groups. We have Reform, primarily the German Jews, conservative, mostly Eastern European folks who want to do American culture, and then the Orthodox being the traditionalists, praying in Hebrew and trying to preserve the traditions of their Russian and Polish family. Mordechai Kaplan comes along, as we saw, about 1920, and he revolutionizes the whole thing. He comes over as an Orthodox rabbi, traditional mindset, but he's got this conservative bend. He likes modernity, he likes science, he likes John Dewey, he likes sociology, he loves America, he loves American democracy. And he falls in love with a democratic ideal that he wants to import into Judaism itself. And so in 1920, when he sees that women in America get the right to vote, he's flabbergasted. He loves them. And he wants to do that kind of revolutionary approach to Judaism. And so in 1922, the first of his 5 daughters hits the age of maturity. She's 13, it's time for her bat mitzvah. He has the first bat mitzvah ever. Completely changes the nature of Judaism, of liberal, of non-Orthodox Judaism. And so kicks the door open and says, hey, we can do Jewish differently. And so it's a phenomenal new idea that you can still have a traditional mindset, you can still have American dreams, and you can still say you want to have a voice of equality for the people who are being marginalized.
You could say he modernized.
Yeah, for sure. Sure, David's point that he modernizes Judaism is terrific. And so that influence really helps the conservative movement for about 30 years. He teaches at the conservative movement's seminary, Jewish Theological Seminary, and alongside him for 30 years is Abraham Joshua Heschel. And they're arguing with each other all the time about which way to go. Heschel's a mystic, Kaplan's a rationalist, and they just can't agree on God because they've got two different perspectives on it. Heschel comes right before World War II hits, and World War II changes the entire face of American Judaism. Before World War II, Jews in America were racialized, right? When Ford wants to argue about Jews being inferior, he's using the same language of Hitler. He's saying Jews are a race, we need to get them out of here, they're a problem. Racial identity in 1930 was very different than racial identity today. But if you imagine that Italians and Irish and Spanish thought that they were like a racial group, it was rather normal in the 1920s and 1930s for these ethnic identities to have a racial component that didn't mean black or white, it means perhaps ethnic heritage. So when Kaplan is developing his ideas of Jewish peoplehood, he's also looking, and he doesn't use the term Judaism or race, he uses Judaism as a civilization. but is something similar to what might have been understood as a racial idea in 1934 when he writes that. I see.
Oh, yeah, I was just kind of thinking back to like my sociology training and how we determine what race is and how that has changed so many times. Like the census question, like what race are you,
Yeah.
has changed many times, you know, depending on what year it is, you're either white or you're not white. It's really crazy. So it's very, we would say, socially constructed.
So I want to hold Aaron's piece of this whiteness piece, because the whiteness piece will become how Jews wind up identifying as white folk at the end of this historical walk. Because in 1944, before the end of World War II, we weren't white folk. We were something else. We were dark. We were not white. We shouldn't have been treated right. So you know, from my grandparents' perspective, their identity was not as white folk. They never encountered life as white folk.
I've heard the phrase like Schrodinger's minority to other, you know, other minorities. Jews are white. To white people, Jews are not white.
Right.
It's kind
Yeah. So the simplified way to think about this is from a Nazi perspective or a neo-Nazi perspective. Jews are as problematic to Nazis or neo-Nazis as Black folk, brown folk, yellow folk, right? They all need, all those groups need to get minimized to purify the white race. So a lot of this animosity is coming out of Nazi Germany, right? That's the real place of propaganda around this white nationalism that, you know, develops between 1939 and 1944.
But in those days, when Jews were a race, a lot of Jews don't look Jewish. They don't look, a lot of people can't tell that they're Jewish. If you're walking in the street, how would somebody know?
Yeah, right.
You look like a white.
Well, we know that, but from a white nationalist perspective, they've got to come up with some markers. So they come up with big noses, they come up with short Jewish men, they come up with, you know, olive colored skin and curly hair. And so they're, you know, from their perspective, there are markers that can identify some of us, but certainly not all of us.
Yeah,
completely right. All right. So after World War II, America feels very guilty because 6 million Jews had just died, and they could have stopped it, and they didn't. And it's out of this shame, this deep humiliation, that Truman and the others say, all right, we can fix this a little bit. We can say yes to the state of Israel. We can allow these refugees a place to land because we can't house them here, right? There were hundreds of thousands of Jews surviving the death camps who needed homes, and they weren't going to come here.
My question, how could they have fixed it?
So Elie Wiesel's question on this to every American president was, how come they didn't bomb the rail lines when they knew about Auschwitz? They knew about Auschwitz in 1941. And not once, not one bomb ever landed on those train lines.
That is a very good question.
So it's a fascinating challenge. I don't want to devolve this into a Holocaust class, but we could have done much more.
Okay, I get you.
We cracked the code early, right? We knew the spy codes were cracked.
We could have bombed the crematorium.
But we didn't want it. We didn't want to do that, right? We didn't want the Germans to know we cracked the code.
I see. I got you.
Okay.
And I mean, I would argue there was a lot of anti-Semitism here.
Yes,
Like we cracked the code and we didn't want them to know, but also
want to respect George Patton, don't think about it.
All right, so where I want to come back to is America after World War II, 1946, 47. That sense of guilt and shame opens the doors culturally to Jews to be considered differently. That after the war, Jews are welcomed into this country with a level of appropriateness that they can sit alongside Catholics and Protestants. Now, for Catholics, it's a new thing too, right? Catholics have been minimized and ostracized for over 100 years. So I'm not Catholic, I can't tell that history as well as a Catholic priest, but post-World War II, the new thing that comes to America is this welcoming of not just Protestants, not just Catholics, but Jews as well. So that suburban growth in American metropolitan centers not only develops new housing, new home locations, but American Jews who are now getting wealthy are moving. They're leaving the cities. They've been completely urban until 1944, 45, and now they're fleeing to the suburbs like their other middle-class friends, the white Protestants, and they're filling the suburbs. And so Jewish synagogues in the 1950s are cropping up in all the different suburbs across the country. And we start to see the suburbanization of American Judaism. Really, so if you think about temples and synagogues and how they looked like in the 30s or 20s, how they look like in the 50s and 60s, right? Small synagogues to huge suburban palaces, dramatic difference of your presentation and your pride and this level of acceptance. Before you're hiding yourself. Yeah. Now you can say, hey, this is my house of worship alongside other houses of worship.
Well, I understand now, but I'd never understood when I was a child or, 10, 12, 14, 15, how come Catholics and Protestants weren't friends? How come there was something?
Great question, not for this class.
Yeah, but I mean, I understand now the whole story, but I was so puzzled why there was a problem between them. But they were all Christians, so why was there a problem? But I know now exactly why.
Okay, quick one.
So you're saying predominantly urban. I was thinking when all the Eastern European, they were predominantly very rural farmers. Is there any reason they didn't strike out west?
Some did. Some did. Most were merchants. So the rural ones may have wound up in rural settings, but most were merchants, and most wind up in merchant environments doing garment industry work. And the simple answer. All right, so we're thinking now in the 1950s. I'm gonna mute a couple of folks because we're getting some background information. So I want to move us now to the 1960s because we know America changes radically with the 1960s. Judaism changes radically with the 1960s as well. What is so let me back up half a step before the 1960s and the 50s. As I mentioned earlier, conservative Judaism becomes the leading movement in American Judaism. Almost well over a third of American Jews identify as conservative. Reform is small and Orthodox is teeny tiny. In the 60s, with the upsweep of the hippies, what happens to Judaism is it gets hippified. And the way we think about this is called the Chavurah movement. Jewish identity moves from synagogues that are large and ostentatious and very expensive to living rooms where you get your friends together and you have a nice dinner and anyone leads the service and you don't really need a rabbi because we're hippies and we could care less about authority figures. We just want to do Shabbat. And so this fascinating fabric begins to develop in the 1960s that is going to revolutionize American Judaism because it's going to shift the focus of power away from hierarchy, away from institutions, to what we call DIY Judaism, do it yourself. You got 5 friends, you bring them together, you have a Seder because you want to and you can. And why not? The Chavurah movement flourishes quickly. It takes fire. It is accepted as in both the Reconstructionist movement and the Renewal movement as like the next new thing, the next new way of doing Jewish. And what the Chavurah movement brings is not only this flattening of authority, but a welcoming of women. Women are the next new movement on the American scene, and the women's movement of the 70s get swept up directly into the Chavurah movement, and women rabbis are welcomed into rabbinical schools in the Reform and Reconstructionist movement. And all of a sudden, we're seeing a real shift and change among liberal Jews and liberal Jewish communities that is very organic and very different.
Can you explain Reconstructionist? I never understood exactly what that meant.
Yeah, let me kind of distinguish that for a minute. So David's question is about Reconstructionist Judaism as distinct from Reform and Conservative. When Kaplan starts teaching, he considers himself in the conservative movement. So he's kind of on that liberal edge of the conservative movement. He's traditional, but he still wants democratic values. The Reconstructionist movement has a different hub of the wheel. So if we think of every Jewish movement as its own motivating anxiety, for Orthodox Judaism, the hub of the wheel that moves that community is Jewish law, halakha law. That's your hub. For conservative Judaism, it's halakha informed by science and modernity, but that's the hub, right? For Reform Jews, they've let go of halakha. It's about individual autonomy, empowering the individual, giving the individual complete and absolute autonomy to make his or her own choices. That's Reform Judaism's hub of the wheel. Reconstructionist groups' hub is community. The individual doesn't have complete autonomy. The rabbi doesn't have complete autonomy. The tradition doesn't have all of these things come together for a democratic process, and the democratic process of building community becomes how that identity develops. It is not necessarily different from Reform in that they're both liberal, but I guess the distinction is Reform empowers everyone to make their own choices. Reconstructionists say we've got to make a decision together about how to hire a new rabbi.
Yeah,
we're not just going to hire the next new guy. We're going to come together and figure out who we want.
Yeah,
and so they take a vote.
That sounds great. That sounds the best.
Very American, very democratic, right? And so that's kind of like a way to begin to orient your thinking about. Very similar to Reform, liberal, welcoming of gays, welcoming of women.
Wouldn't Reform actually be that way? Wouldn't Reform actually,
maybe,
tend to be that way? Like one person's not going to say, I'm going to make all the decisions.
Depends. It depends on the different Reform communities. Some are very individualistic, some are very community focused. And so as a movement, it's there to celebrate the individual. It's not there to necessarily celebrate the community. It's going to empower the individual always to make individual autonomous decisions.
What if there's 2 or 3 individuals that want to make decisions?
Yeah, right. Then you have to become president of the synagogue.
Oh.
Okay. I want to pause the walk through the 60s and 70s and the women's movement because I'm going to ask Ezra now to share the screen, and we're going to look at a cross section of who is a Jew and how do these different groups develop their different definitions of who's a Jew. So what we're going to do is kind of work through this one line at a time. So we're going to work through the first line with the Jewish value, who's a Jew, and we see that we're going to start from the traditional end and work backwards. So we're going to work from all the way on the right with traditional Jews, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. The simple definition of who is a Jew: you're born of a Jewish mom. Very simple. Who's a Jew? You have a Jewish mom. End of story. Yeah.
What if your mom is born of a Jewish mom and has a non-Jewish father who converted?
If the mom is Jewish, story's over. Simple.
That was my case.
Moderate Jews, the conservative Jews, still kind of value this traditional legal definition, and conservative Jews still kind of use this that the birth mother, genetically transmits her Judaism in what's called matrilineal descent. In the late 60s for Reconstructionists and the early 80s for Reform, they said that's not good enough. We're going to go by both matrilineal descent and patrilineal descent. We're going to say the Jewish mother or the Jewish father can transmit the Jewish identity. And we're going to make a break with traditional Judaism about this. It's a huge break. It's a huge, and in Israel, it's still a problematic break.
Could you say that again now?
Yeah. In the late 60s for Reconstructionists and the early 80s for Reform, they say you can go by either the Jewish father or the Jewish mother. Not only the Jewish mom will be the deciding point. And so what we can see is that by this moment, liberal Judaism is defining itself dramatically different than the moderate and the traditional folks. But there's a lot going on in the liberal movement that also influences its liberal status. So we go to the next line. Can women be rabbis? Start again in the, we'll start here now with the liberals because this is a helpful date. So for liberal Jews, both in the Reform and Reconstructionist movement, in the women's movement, that was big, right? Women's equality in the early 70s, the ERA, right? All that. Women have been rabbis since 1973. You would expect the conservative movement to kind of follow suit, 5 years later. But look, it takes them 14 years, 1987, before the first woman rabbi is ordained in the conservative movement. And Orthodox, not yet, not ever. Women are not of equal status in traditional Judaism. They can't, by definition, be rabbis because rabbis have to have some status in the community, and women don't have that kind of status in the community.
Do you think that might change with this modern Orthodox?
So yeah, the new development here is modern Orthodox women in the last 10 years are getting a new title. It's not rabbi, it's maharat. So a maharat is like a spiritual decision maker, an educated woman who goes to seminary and learns the same stuff that the men learn, but she doesn't have the legal power of a rabbi saying the kosher chicken is kosher or not. But she has the same education. She's going to run the school. She's going to run the institution. She might be in charge of all the teachers. She has certain power. She just doesn't have the power to run the community like the male rabbi does. So the new modern Orthodox answer to this is this tiny, tiny group out of New York called Yeshivat Maharat that is ordaining modern Orthodox women.
I'm praying that the Messiah comes back down as a woman.
Okay, could be. The third line is queer marriage. So when do these groups recognize, acknowledge, and think through queer marriage? For Reform and Reconstruction, same time, 73. Right, the first in that first class in the Reconstructionist movement of women rabbis, one of those women was a lesbian, and so by default, they just had their grandfather that in. So we're going to be not like for women, for lesbians. They lay about 5 years later, they formalized that. Reform at the same time. So by 1980, both Reform and Reconstructionist movements are welcoming and open to lesbian and gay rabbis. And we would expect the conservative movement to take, 5, 10 years. But look what they did.
Wow.
32, 34 years later, right? How long are they going to wait? And in 2007, they cut the baby in half. It's not like they said all conservative rabbis who are queer can come out of the closet. They said only if you're in a community that welcomes LGBTQ folk can they then come out of the closet. So it's very much case by case. And created a huge rift in the conservative movement. Queerness in the Orthodox community is not a closed book. It's just not a very big book. I know of a couple Orthodox rabbis, they're both men, who are queer and still Orthodox in the modern Orthodox community. And they are doing their best to keep some voice there. What they're doing is they're kind of making case for teenagers who are realizing they're queer, not to be ostracized, to be at least welcomed in and loved and celebrated. But they can't be, there are no queer rabbis coming out of Orthodox seminaries.
No wonder they're losing ground.
Well, the Orthodox are status quo, conservative is dropping.
No, I mean conservatives.
Yeah, conservative is dropping, yeah.
And this, so you're just talking about rabbis, what about marriages? No, we're not in that, I mean, you're not.
So, yeah, so alongside marriage as well, queer marriage is accepted very early on, and so it becomes celebrated. So in the Reform and Reconstructionist movements, alongside welcoming in queer rabbis is welcoming in queer partners. And so we've had wedding language in our prayer books of welcoming in the groom and the groom, or the bride and the bride. And that's very different than traditional language about welcoming in queer folk. The last column here is trans rabbis. The liberal movements, as you could assume, very early on. 2004 is anecdotally now. I don't. This could be off by a year or two, but I know Elliot Kukla was ordained in the Reform movement, I think in 2004, and Jacob Lieberman was ordained in 2012 in the Reconstructionist movement. I don't know if the conservative movement has trans rabbinical students today. I would be surprised if they don't. I know that there's been a number of them so far, and so I don't think they're necessarily banned. I just think they haven't thought that that was a viable option for their job or their career path. I could be wrong. I haven't done any recent research, let's say in the last 3 years, with the two conservative seminaries to see who their current population is. But there's no rabbi today in the conservative movement who's identified as trans. So what we begin to see, and this goes back to Cheryl's earlier question about interfaith marriage, we can then kind of map where interfaith marriage is going to be safe and where interfaith marriage is problematic. And going back here, you know, the who's a Jew question, that becomes the interfaith marriage question, because both Reform and Reconstructionist rabbis are relatively comfortable marrying interfaith folk, and they have been for 40 years. Conservative are not permitted. My wife's a conservative rabbi. If she officiates at an interfaith marriage, she could be kicked out of the movement. If she attends an interfaith marriage, she could be kicked out of the movement. So when her brother married a Christian woman, what was she supposed to do? They had a public wedding where she just happened upon the wedding, where she was walking and they were there, and oh, look, there's my brother. Oh, look, he just got married.
I love it.
Oh, look at how fancy we are.
Yeah, I love it.
Did they do that on purpose? So
Yes, absolutely,
Yeah.
because her job was on the line. And if they found out that she is attending her brother's wedding, she would have been bounced. And they do bounce. Right? This is not a game for conservative rabbis. This is a real issue.
What is the purpose of not allowing people to even attend? Is it just they're against interfaith marriage?
Yeah. For their perspective, it's a great question. Jewish continuity from the conservative and traditional perspective is based on Jews marrying Jews. Because when a Jew marries a Jew, they'll have Jewish babies. The theory, and it was just a theory, was that in the 1990s, when intermarriage became very popular, the theory was that when these children of Jewish partners and non-Jewish partners would grow up, they would just become not Jewish. And that's wrong. What we now know is that 60% of those people who are married from a rabbi raise Jewish kids.
Yeah.
So that assumption of Jewish continuity was faulty. And it doesn't mean they've changed, it just means they're going with these faulty assumptions.
And probably they're never going to be conservatives.
But this kind of lays out Cheryl's point about the welcoming nature of interfaith families for these two Jewish groups and the less than welcoming nature. Now, that being said, I have worked in conservative synagogues who've struggled mightily to say, okay, we may not have to marry them, but we can still love them. And so what do they do if someone gets married around the corner at the park with friends and then joins the synagogue? Do you love them? Of course you do. And so part of this is, it's kind of a don't ask, don't tell policy for conservative Jews. So interfaith couples wind up in this fraught perspective. They can't have their rabbi marry them, but they can have life cycle events. They can have bar and bat mitzvah. So
They could join the conservative temple.
they can, as long as they function by the conservative bylaws and boundaries. Okay, Ezra, I'm going to check and see if there's questions in the chat because I see the numbers cropping up. I want to pause myself and see if there's questions about the chart that I posted.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Gordon does have his hand raised though.
Okay, Gordon, go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot to take that down.
Well, that's okay.
My bad.
So let me pause and see if there's questions here about this Jewish identity chart on who's a Jew, and if there's stuff that I need to circle back or clarify. David, go ahead.
Is it possible for somebody just to declare themselves a Jew?
Yeah, amazing question. I want to make sure we all hear that because New York, Manhattan ran a census of Jews about 5 years ago. And they asked David's question because why not?
Yeah.
And what they realized was in New York in, let's say, I think 2015, 2016, I can't remember the exact year, of the Jews who answered the Jewish census question in Manhattan, I think it was, 90% of the Jews were born of Jewish parents or had conversion or something like that. 10% of the Jews in Manhattan are not Jewish by these definitions. Phenomenal, right? Phenomenal that 10% of the people in Manhattan are not Jewish by the definitions that we just put on our chart.
But they claim they're Jewish.
Sure.
And
For the census, they did. Yeah.
So then, okay, so I kind of have a question. I'm kind of thinking back to this, to your question, like the 10% of Jews who were like, okay, they're Jewish, that's cool. So if they were to show up at, like, let's say a conservative synagogue or temple, who's gonna know?
Right.
I
Of
mean,
course. Who's
that's
gonna?
kind of my question.
Yeah.
So like, we're talking about, okay, so in Reform and Reconstructionist, if the dad's Jewish, the kids are Jewish. But everyone else is like, no.
Yeah.
But they grew up Jewish, everything's Jewish, they did all the steps, and they're like, okay, well, now I want to go to this conservative synagogue. Are they like, no, but how would they know? Do they ask?
And so Aaron's really interesting point can be layered onto the Jews of color. So many Jews of color in the last 25 years have just practiced stuff and have, for a variety of reasons, found comfort doing Jewish stuff. And maybe after 2 generations, they're doing more of it and want to do it in Jewish institutions like synagogues, and they're finding themselves in Jewish synagogues. And all of a sudden we are asking ourselves, oh my gosh, folks have been doing Jewish, maybe not the ways my parents or grandparents did Jewish. And then we have to sit with them and figure out their journey and their needs, and how can we welcome them in. And they have very different needs, Jews of color, than white-skinned Jews. And this goes back to that whole whiteness question. There's a great book written about 20 years ago called The Price of Whiteness, how Jews lost a certain cachet by being people of color when they became white people in the 50s. And that's the price of whiteness, right? Jews have become white folk in the last 40, 50 years. And there's a certain cost to being white, but you're not assumed to be in that people of color realm anymore. Really interesting book, sociologist about 20 years ago. Really interesting. Okay, Gordon, go ahead. Oh wait, let me see, Jean and then Gordon.
Okay. If you're, say, Orthodox or conservative, and you do end up marrying outside the faith, where do you go if you want to stay Jewish? Do you? I know you talked about some people sort of going back in kind of anyway, but do they end up as Reconstructionist or Reform to any extent?
It's a curious question, Jim. We're not quite sure how that plays out. Anecdotally, we know of these cases of folks doing this or that. I know I was working in Salt Lake City for 6 years for the high holidays, and I would get a number of stories from college students in Salt Lake City where the parents, they would have a Jewish father marry a Mormon mom. The Jewish dad would convert to Mormonism because they're living in Salt Lake City. They would be raised with Jewish culture, but then the college student would wonder, is he Jewish? So that was question number one. I would say, from my lens, a Jewish dad, that's enough, right? You can come in and develop your Jewish identity. But then the second question was, oh, Rabbi, I see you need an extra singer for high holidays. My dad used to be a cantor, the guy who converted to Mormonism. Can he sing for high holidays? I said, you want him to sing the prayer where I'm renouncing all of my vows on Kol Nidre, but your dad can't, he's still considered a Mormon? I don't think he can do that yet. I said, if he wants to think about reaffirming his Judaism like a convert would, to study for that affirmation, calling it a reaffirmation instead of conversion, fine. But he's going to have to come and say, that whole Mormon thing is done for me before I can ask him to lead a Kol Nidre, right? A fascinating question. So I can say that the son did go through his affirmation process and is functioning as a Jewish adult. The father, it wasn't so important to him. It was a cute song. He liked the song, but it was never so meaningful that he needed to do anything more than just ask the question. Hang on, Gordon, I see your hand, and then we'll go to David.
Okay, so I have two questions. First is, what lost cachet are you talking about with being supposedly not white, even though at least most American Jews do indeed look white?
Good question. So the price of whiteness is the idea that in 1990, let's say, or even in 1995, people who considered themselves Jews who are sympathetic to people of color might have had a choice about whether they were considering themselves allies of people of color and might have considered themselves not necessarily white folk, right? If my grandmother wanted to say that she wasn't a white person because of the way she was treated as a young adult in the 30s and 40s, she would have actually a legitimate claim to not being part of identifying herself as a white person on census forms. And what the sociologist is saying is, no, once you live in America through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you've given up that ability to identify as a person of color. You're now a white person, and it is completely fair because you have white skin to be labeled a white person, even without your specific identity to identify that whiteness. And so there is a certain price of whiteness that we have lost some of that gray zone that we used to have once we became fully welcomed into the American culture in the 50s.
And thank you. And my other question is, so the specific definition is just if you have a Jewish dad or a Jewish mom, but what about converts to Judaism, or alternatively, people who have both a Jewish mom and a Jewish dad, but then get baptized as a Christian? So what about those two groups of people?
Yeah, let me kind of do those one at a time.
Okay.
So conversion kind of falls along the same chart that liberal Jews are very welcoming of conversion candidates, both in Reform and Reconstructionist communities. And we have deeply benefited from their conversion process in the last 25 or 30 years, but that's still rather new. We didn't always have significant numbers of conversion folks knocking on our doors. So this is perhaps a 21st century trend, that this is a new development for American folks to consider leaving the majority status and wanting to identify as Jewish. There were most of the folks prior to, let's say, 1990, who converted to Judaism did it for the sake of marriage. When you married a Jewish partner, you might have wanted to do it for the partner's sake or for the children's sake. And so a number of people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s converted to Judaism because of marriage. But I think what happened was, as intermarriage became so popular, I would imagine many of those conversion candidates realized they didn't have to convert. They could just do whatever they wanted. They could either continue living their birth religion, or they could convert when it was appropriate for them. And they could kind of change the timing of that. And so what we saw was, beginning in the 1990s, midway 2000s, we saw like conversion candidates who were coming at specific times, when their mom or dad had died, or when they got married, or when they had given birth to kids from a Jewish partner. So we began to notice like life cycles of conversion candidates. That being said, I will say that the conservative movement has kind of been participating in this open door policy of welcoming conversion folks as well. And what they do is they kind of just add in their own boundaries as part of their conversion process, which is appropriate, right? We're all kind of trying to maintain our boundaries to whatever extent they exist. Orthodox still is very stringent about conversion, and they're very limiting and really are very comfortable rejecting nearly everybody for conversion for several years, until that person actually moves into the community, functions in the community, and really develops a community presence. And then they kind of might soften depending if they're partnered with a Jew in a Jewish home or not. So I will say the conversion process has altered this and allowed us to think about a new category of who's a Jew, because we are getting significant numbers recently of people in the non-Orthodox movements who are thinking about Jewish identity. I saw David, you had a question.
Yeah, my question is about Mormons, so I'm going to wait till after.
Okay. Let me check the time, 5:15. So let me kind of do a historical piece, because we kind of named some of these historical pieces, but I want to be a little bit specific about Jewish denominations, because that's the theme for today. For a long time in this country, there were three places that you could become a rabbi. You could do that in the Reform movement, the conservative movement, or the Orthodox movement. And up until about 1970, that was pretty much the case. The Reconstructionist movement began their seminary in 1973. And so it's a teeny tiny group, like it's like 2% of the entire country. Actually, the numbers keep doubling. So I think we might be close to 4%, right? We're barely on the radar
But
screen.
you're really,
Yeah.
you're really jumping.
But we're doubling, which means that in the 80s and 90s, there were 4 seminaries kind of sitting side by side. And then around 2000, we saw a few new seminaries crop up that were called post-denominational or trans-denominational, thinking about Judaism beyond the boundaries of denominational limits. The way to think about this kind of Jewish identity is probably best seen on college campuses. So Aaron, when you were in college, many of your classmates who are Jewish might have said at Hillel on Friday night, they were just Jews. They might have grown up Reform, they might have grown up conservative, they might have not grown up with anything. They're just Jews. And that specific denominational label is next to meaningless. So the future of Judaism today, like when we're looking 5, 10 years from now, we don't see a lot of denominational growth. We see a lot of just Jews wanting to do Seder or Shabbat or weddings, and they want to do them on their terms. They still want to do DIY stuff, and they could really care less about the labels. So I think the next generation of Jews, the college students on campus today, even the college students from 10 years ago that are developing this new perspective on Jewish identity, they're shifting and changing Judaism in a phenomenal way, because these former boxes might have been handy, but they might now be meaningless. And I think that's a really valuable piece to hold, that we might be on the edge of a new kind of regrouping of the Jewish mindset. And I could envision not too far in the distant future where we have 2 groups of Jews. We have Orthodox Jews who still do Orthodox Judaism because that's precious to them, and we have everybody else. And everybody else will figure out what they want to do, and they'll enjoy it, and they'll just figure out their own comfort zone in that wide, non-Orthodox perspective. And that might actually be a very fascinating way to think about the future of American Judaism. Not tomorrow, not even 5 years from today, but when my son Gabriel is a college student 10 years from now, I think he's going to have radically different choices about doing Jewish. And I think it's going to be much closer to what college students are experiencing on campus than what we are experiencing in synagogue. It can be very, very different. Okay, Ezra, anything in the chat that we should be tending to?
Nothing in the chat.
Then let me take a few minutes and talk about the Pew Research. So in 2020, the Pew Research folks put out some census information about the latest numbers of American Jews. And what we saw there was that the Reform movement is now the #1 movement in American Judaism. And they grew a tiny bit. They grew in 8 years from 33% to 37%. The conservative movement, as I mentioned, continued to dwindle. I think in that research, they're down to maybe 16%. And the forecast is that that's going to continue to drop. They had been 7 years earlier, I think at 19 or 20%. Reconstructionists, as I mentioned, doubled, the 3, teeny tiny group, but the Orthodox stay the same, which is really interesting because Orthodox is growing, right? They have lots of babies. So you'd expect them to be growing radically. So why aren't their census numbers growing? Because I think a lot of adults are leaving. So every time you've got, let's say, 7 babies, you might have 7 adults walking out the back door. Fascinating way to change your demographic
Yeah.
numbers when your children are growing up and the adults are leaving.
So what's their percent for Orthodox?
9, I believe. 8 or 9 kind of varies, like in the 7, 8, 9, somewhere in there. I think it was 10
Yeah.
7 years ago, and now I think it's 8 or 9. The new growth, though, in this demographic chart, which is really important to pay attention to, is called the unaffiliated. People that don't identify as any of this, and they just they do whatever they want to do. They don't do labeled Judaism. 8 years ago, that group was probably about 20%. Now it's well over 30%. And it's forecasted that pretty soon they'll be the largest group of Jews in the country. This phenomenon isn't only a Jewish phenomenon. It's going on in the Christian community as well. The largest group of American Christians now are the nuns, the people who are unaffiliated. So what we can see is in America, there is this spiritual secularization going on. People are getting more distant from traditional religious norms. If you come to services here, you know, I don't even use the language of religion. I use the language of spirituality. I don't feel like people resonate with those language of religious terms anymore. And so I just don't use that kind of language. And I think what we can begin to think about is that as we are building Jewish community, if we're not paying attention to this group of unaffiliated folks and why they're unaffiliated and what they're doing, because just because they identify as unaffiliated doesn't mean they don't do Jewish. It just means they're not members of a synagogue. So if I am, you know, out at a park at a Jewish festival and I'm meeting people, if I don't have a welcoming stance to those folks, they'll never come to this place. But if I can greet them and say, wow, amazing. I'd love to spend time with you and find out how we can celebrate the Jewish holidays or celebrate your new baby and give them a Jewish name, or right, all the ways that their Jewish identity might need support, they might develop a relationship with us. It's a lot of work, right? That wasn't part of the job description when I was hired, either at Hillel or here, but that's the new task of being a rabbi now, right? To be in conversation with folks who we don't know yet. And how do we engage them? And how do we engage them sincerely?
Is anyone doing research on this?
Slowly. It's like the new topic. And so the Christian community is really trying to research it quickly because they're devastated by this. Institutional Christianity is dropping phenomenally, and churches are closing because, you know, the numbers are getting so small. And the pandemic is only heightening this.
Sure.
What we're beginning to see is kind of a pivot post-pandemic or during the pandemic to say that one of the reasons we started doing Zoom was to reach out to people who couldn't be in the building because it wasn't safe to be in the building. I think we're going to be doing Zoom for years because people can join on their own terms. They can keep their cup of coffee, they can stay on their couch, and they can still participate, right? It's a very easy.
Bad weather.
And so all of a sudden, if I'm thinking about meeting the needs of the people who are in this room and meeting the needs of the people in the Zoom environment, it makes my job harder, but it makes it more meaningful because then I've got two groups to take care of.
Yeah.
Not just the folks who show up, but also the folks who are participating as they want to and are getting meaning out of the online experiences. So it's really, I think, changing the lens of spiritual communities, and it's asking us to think differently. The one story I can share very quickly, my wife runs our little religious school there for the kids and the young families. And what we started doing during the pandemic, so like as the pandemic hit, we were closing down everything. She started delivering every 3 weeks a loaf of challah bread and a little bottle of grape juice and 2 little tea lights to all of her religious school families.
Wow.
Every 3 weeks, there'd be a knock at the door and a little package would arrive, and they would get this little gift. And so about 3 months into this pandemic experience, she started getting these amazing thank you notes. And or on Zoom, the kids would say, hey, we did Shabbat dinner because you dropped off challah and grape juice at our door. Oh my God, when we give them the tools, they'll do Jewish. So why would we ever stop, right? But we never asked that question before, right? It took the pandemic to think about community in a completely new way to say, how about if we give them the tools and allow them to do what they want to do? I think that's going to be a phenomenal question for Jewish communities in the future. How can we be resources and get them whatever those pieces are, and then allow them to do the Jewish stuff on their terms? Really a foundational shift in how we can think about the folks we're connecting to and interacting. Okay, I'm going to pause here and just take any questions or comments as we wrap this up, and then we'll do a quick reading assignment for next week.
So it's kind of encompassing everything. I know they're sort of inconsequentially small in America, but where do the other sort of, I guess, non-rabbinical sects, like the Hayamot, the Kabarites, or the Samaritans?
Yeah, they're tiny groups.
Like I know they're Jewish,
sort of, yeah.
debatable in some of the other circles.
So the Karaites and the Karaites are not rabbinic Jews, and they're tiny. They are primarily in and around North Africa and Israel, but they're tiny.
There's some in like Crimea.
Yeah, some in Crimea, some in Europe, but very, very, very small. The group that I want to kind of say is adjacent to that in the kind of question is the Black Hebrews. So in this country, in various urban settings, we've got different groups of Black Hebrews who are doing Jewish on their terms. And I have visited a couple of them in Philadelphia and are loosely connected to the group in Chicago. And in both cases, the Philadelphia case and the Chicago case, these Black Hebrews learn Hebrew. They attend a conservative style service for not 3 hours on Saturday morning, but for 6 hours on Saturday morning. And it feels like a gospel worship service. And you go, oh, that sounds like fun. I'll sing gospel music for a couple hours in Hebrew. That would be a lot of fun. And so what these two groups, and by extension, there's more than two of these, right? There's groups in New York and in Florida and a few others. They are kind of reframing Black Jewish identity. Some of them are getting rabbinic ordination. Capers Funyeh is in Chicago. Capers Funyeh is the rabbi for the Black Hebrew group in Chicago. He is also Michelle Obama's cousin. And so he's got this really interesting intersection because he's connected to celebrities. He gets a lot of ink. He gets a lot of celebrity status. He also went through Reform conversion and Reform ordination. So as a Reform rabbi for his community, he's trying to tell other Black Hebrew groups, we can be accepted if we want to do this Jewish stuff, but we're going to have to kind of go through their hoops and their boundaries if we want that level of acceptance. Now, he's not saying everyone needs to, but he now sits on the Chicago Board of Rabbis. So here in Cleveland, we've got a board of rabbis. If someone from the Cleveland Black Hebrew community wanted to join us, we might use that as an example, saying, well, we know we did this in Chicago. Where are you with this dynamic? Are you interested in? So it's a really interesting thing about folks who are doing something akin to Jewish and maybe not following all the institutional boundaries. Would we want to have them in our constellation of folks like a board of rabbis? It's a really new and interesting question. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the homework assignment. we are going to talk about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot, because I skipped over that. It was a complete accident. We were supposed to do it last week. We did rituals instead. That was okay. And it's fine because we're not anywhere near the fall, but we'll look at the fall holidays. In both books, there are sections on the fall holidays. Pick whichever book you're enjoying. So if you like Essential Judaism, use that. If you like Michael Strasfeld's writing voice, use his. They're really good. They're also very detailed. There's a lot to read about these. So you don't have to read everything, but get a handle at least on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or both. Right? Those are the two big ones. And next week we'll talk about the fall holidays, and that'll be our last academic session, and then our closing session will be on contemporary topics. Okay, any closing questions or comments? We wrapped up the homework, and I'm just seeing if there's any other final comments or questions as we wrap this up today. Cheryl, go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of a question about the unaffiliated Jews.
Sure, yeah.
One of my impressions, especially now someone who moved from an urban area to a small town, is that the Jewish community centers have been a place where a lot of unaffiliated Jews can be Jewish, as you would call it, and have a sense of community, and they don't necessarily attend synagogues, but they do belong to JCCs. I mean, I found moving here that it felt much more important to belong to a synagogue because there's not that here. There's no delis, there's no place to sort of rub shoulders with other Jewish people unless you really work at it. So I'm wondering about the unaffiliated. Are those mostly urban Jews who have options like JCCs? And
I certainly think that, I think you're naming a part of it. I think part of these are the cultural Jews who do cultural secular Jewish practices. They watch Seinfeld probably, or whatever. But their Jewish identity is not a religious Jewish identity, right? They could care less about being here for the holidays. They just want to do Jewish on their terms. So I think the JCC certainly meets their needs to some extent, right? And I also think generationally, it fits a very other interesting piece that some folks find their needs met by JCCs, other folks don't. And so I think JCCs certainly fit a specific demographic of young families with kids, right? They need childcare, or elders who need senior care, right? Those are the primary resources in JCCs, is the kid care and the senior care, and kind of the adult ed that sits in between that. So I think some of this is a JCC piece. I think another part of this are interfaith marriages for folks who have, for whatever reason, found a loving partner who's not Jewish, and they're just not clear like what that means regarding the Jewish communities, and they haven't had the need or the desire to seek that out. And so one of the ways I think about your question, Charles, from the lens of those life cycles we talked about, that a few times in a life you actually need a rabbi. When your baby is born, when you get married, when your baby becomes a bar bat mitzvah, and when you die. Right? At those 4 times, you might really think that even if you're a secular JCC Jew, you might want to be in a conversation with a rabbi who can navigate a bris or navigate a Jewish wedding or something like that. So therefore, I think part of the way we connect to these unaffiliated is through these life cycle events, and therefore finding ways to meet the needs of people who are not part of our community and offer life cycle experiences, I think is a very big, valuable way to do outreach, to find folks who might connect. And so I continue to do interfaith weddings for people who aren't members. I don't have the time to do that. But if someone knocks on my door and says, hey, I'm going to marry my non-Jewish partner, will you marry us? I will actually sit and say, yeah, let's talk about that. Let's see if I've got a couple hours in my schedule, because I feel like we need to find different ways to say yes to people when they knock on our doors. Okay, any other closing comments or questions tonight as we kind of wrap this up? Okay, so Yom Ha'atzmaut, Thursday, find a celebration, celebrate. I think it's going to be very fun. Have some falafel. And then this Saturday morning at Temple Beth Shalom, there's a bat mitzvah. So you can all kind of, we're not going to do this on Zoom. It's just going to be for the folks who are here in person. There will not be a Zoom presentation of the bat mitzvah. And then Sunday will be our class.
How long does that service usually take?
The bat mitzvah, it's about 2 hours, an hour and 45 minutes is where I tell the family.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great week, everyone. I'll see everybody next Sunday. Take care.